Good Tuesday morning, scholars. I hope this finds you well. As mentioned yesterday, today is going to be a listen to a lecture kind of day, mainly because we need to make sure that we have a basic understanding of these major critical theories as we move forward. Now, there's two things I need you to understand. Number one, the information that I'm about to give you is not the extent of everything. There is much information in regards to how these became thoughts and theories that are applied to analyze things. A lot of background, a lot of historical information. There is more to understanding how to completely apply a lens to a theory, or I'm sorry, a theory lens to a piece of literature. We are just skimming the surface. I'm giving you enough information to be dangerous. In fact, when I was in college, I took an entire course on nothing but critical theories. So we are, as I mentioned, just skimming the surface. And the second thing is this is not an all-inclusive list of all of the theories. There are other theories that we are not going to discuss because we just don't need to for our purposes here. So we are not getting everything you need to know about these theories, and these are not all of the theories. So like I said, you're getting enough information to be dangerous, to broaden your perspective, to be able to apply these lenses, to put on the glasses, so to speak, and to view things from a different angle. But there's a lot more that goes into this, and there are people who subscribe to a particular view or theory, and everything that they write is viewed through that particular lens or filter when that person writes or analyzes a piece of literature. Another thing to consider, as I mentioned briefly yesterday, is that while we are focusing specifically on literature, these theories are not just for analyzing literature. Any art form can be analyzed through these lenses. So keep that in mind as we go through this information as well. So without further ado, let's dive into this a bit. So the first thing is when we talk about these critical theories, you're going to hear different terminology. You're going to hear it called literary theory, critical theory, literary criticisms, and you'll notice also that the theories themselves go by multiple names. So when we talk about these things, we're talking about the way that we're looking at literature, specifically in our case, and going beyond perhaps what is on the surface. So when you read something and you're asked to critique it or analyze it, you're going to be thinking about your previous experience. You're going to be looking at characters. You're going to looking at what's going on, maybe a theme, and so on and so forth. These lenses that you're going to put on, so literally think about taking a pair of glasses and putting them on and having those glasses filter what you see. This is going to take you a bit deeper into what might not be seen from first glance, and that's what we're interested in here. So when we think about this, and I've mentioned most of this already, the two things that you need for literary criticism to happen is the response of the person who's making the critical analysis and the text itself. So their way of we're going to force you to question and look at things based on certain assumptions that each theory has, okay? So when we study these theories and when we think about them, there are things that you need to understand. And when you put on those glasses that I talked about, these assumptions are going to essentially take over your brain and take over your view. And the idea is to try to put aside other things and focus on what's jumping out of the text because of the filter that you are using. So you may not notice any kind of social class structure or how it's affecting characters. But if I force you to think about how a Marxist perspective is affecting the story, now you're looking for it, and now it's going to jump out at you. So what's really interesting about these critical theories and the analysis of literature specifically, or any art form, is the subjective, the opportunity to place a very subjective view on things. So what I mean by that is, if you look at this first question here, that kind of gets us to the point of why this type of analysis is important. Does a text have only one correct meaning? The obvious answer should be no, it does not, because we know that based on everyone's perspectives, based on everyone's backgrounds, values, beliefs, previous knowledge, etc., that everyone brings a little something to the table, and that is going to put a little different flavor on the characters, their situation, the way that we view the theme, etc. And so what's interesting about these critical theories is, essentially, I could assign all of you the same text. So take A Rose for Emily, for example. I give you all A Rose for Emily to read, but I give you all a different pair of glasses through which to filter and analyze the story. So now some of you are focused on character development, and some of you are looking for gender kind of constructs, looking at a more feminist view of things. Some of you are looking for Marxist. Some of you are biographical. So now you're thinking about Faulkner and his background. Some of you are thinking about the historical or cultural considerations. So what's interesting about that is, all of these things, even though you're all reading the same story, all of you are going to come to a bit of a different conclusion about the interactions of these characters, their situation, and how all of that turns out, because of the filter, the lens that you are using to dig in. So when we look at these questions, these rhetorical questions are meant to start to get you to think about why this is important. And it's because literature is so important. If literature was not important, we wouldn't have things like banned books. If literature and other art forms didn't get people to think and movements to start, then there would be no need to shield the public from these thoughts. And so being able to see all of these things, and not only see them through your perspective, but then filtering them through others' perspective, is a pretty unique and interesting tool that we have when going through um, critically analyzing literature or other art forms. So these are just some quotes from the textbook that I had when I was in college that I enjoyed. So you are free to read those. So we have to think about what's leading to our response, right? So if you're having an emotional response, the question then becomes, why am I having that response? And that gets us onto reader response theory, which we'll talk about in just a little bit. And even though that sounds like something you do all the time, and it is, there's more to it. Thinking about what it is that led to that response. And so these theories kind of point you in that direction. And this has been around a really long time, right? So all of these great thinkers and writers, philosophers of our time, from a very long time ago to more modern times, and theories are still being created and added to the repertoire as culture changes. But it should make sense that these great thinkers, in trying to discuss these new philosophies, these new ideas, new ways of living, and values for people, and on all of these different things that were coming up during this time period, that they needed a way to discuss things, not just to say, I don't agree with that, but why don't you agree with that? Or what are you seeing that I'm not seeing? And so in order to help them kind of dig through the analysis of what they were trying to say, applying these theories allowed them to help those discussions. So we're going to get into the theories. Now, let me explain how this works a little bit. So each slide, each theory has a set of slides based on that theory. So for example, here is the social power or Marxist theory. And we get some of the main points in bulleted points on the first slide. On the second slide, there are some questions for analysis. Now, let me explain these. I'm not going to go through each of these on every slide. That would be absolutely horrible for all of us. I'm sure you can read. But also, I want to note that analyzing a theory, using a theory to analyze a piece of literature is not simply going through and answering these questions. These are questions to help set your mind, right? So we're trying to prime your brain to filter the information. So these are things that you're looking for. So remember, we talked about those assumptions, right? So essentially, this is what you have to consider when you're trying to look at something through this lens. These are some questions that can help you do that, but an analysis of a piece is not simply just answering these questions and going about your day. What this does is helps you to start to see things that you may not have seen without the consideration of this particular lens, okay? So each of the theories has those particular components in the slideshow. So if we think about Marxist theory, we are thinking about the ideas of Karl Marx here. And you should know that Karl Marx did not create this critical theory. Someone along the way who found it important to look into the way that people are interacting because of their place in society. So these relationships between society, politics, religion, business within the author, the characters in the story, and their place and whether they're high class, upper class, middle class, lower class, all these different things are going to be an important part of thinking about how these characters are interacting, or why perhaps the author decided to write things or put characters in this particular situation. Okay, so when we think about the Marxist perspective, we want to be considering the thought of socialism. Of course, that was one of Marx's big ideals that he came up with. And you want to think about where the characters are. Okay, so again, upper class, middle class, lower class, and how they're being treated, and what values seem to be at the forefront of the piece, right? So that might come back on the author and looking at their ideas on social theory and the rankings within society and all of that, and how that comes across in his or her writing. Okay, so with the Marxist ideal, again, and I'm going to post this slideshow naked without the video over top of it so that you can save it on your computer and revisit these slides and these ideas whenever needed as we go forward in our discussion and usage of these. Now, this is going to be a lot of information today, okay? Please don't feel overwhelmed. I don't even need you to take notes today. I just need you listening and trying to kind of think about all of this a little bit. So right now, you might think, I have no idea what Marxist theory is, and that's okay, okay? Because again, remember, I'm only giving you enough information to be dangerous with this. When we get into some of our activities where you will start to think about and think through this lens, it'll make a little more sense, okay? So today is a lot of information. I just need you to bear with me. I need you to save the PowerPoint so that you can review it. And I need you to realize that, as I mentioned, there's a lot more information about these theories out there, okay? And we're going to be doing some activities that will help you to start to think about how to apply these theories to art and literature, and how it does make a difference in what you're seeing and the way that you are analyzing that particular piece. Okay? All right. So moving on, we have the historical perspective, which should make some sense because it's thinking about the time period in which the piece was written, and thinking about the culture and the political movements of the time and how it would have been accepted in that time. So how in that time period, how would have people reacted to this piece, okay? And so some things that we need to consider is the accuracy of the time period. So if you are a history buff, this one's going to be very interesting to you. So historically, How would these characters have been accepted or rejected? What are they? Do they seem to be in agreement with the major historical movements of the time or against them? So, for example, if you think of, say, The Great Gatsby, right? It was actually written during the time period that it projects in the story. So, and a lot of times that's not going to line up. Okay. So for historical, you might not have the ability to say it was written during this time period, and here's how it shows that time period. You might have something written futuristic. You might have something written set in the past, but you still want to think about the time period in which it was written and the thoughts and ideals during that time and how it's affecting the way the piece is being produced. So with the Gatsby, we have the 20s and being written in the 20s. And so we want to think about how well that piece depicts that time period. And we need to think about the language being used, because there are, as we know, words evolve over time. So how might the connotation of those words changed, so on and so forth. So thinking about the historical placement of that text in its time period. So check this out, right? So here we go. Here is an ad, okay? And if we were looking at this with historical criticism, there's a couple things I want to point out to you. Number one, we don't want to think about any Marxist theories. So we don't want to think about the place in society of this particular woman that is showcased here. We cannot think about the way that we react to this piece, because in our day to day, we would see this ad. Imagine this ad being on a billboard today, right? We would react probably pretty negatively to this ad. We would not be buying this information. But in this time period, this ad really worked. And so historically, we have to think about the choice of words here, that women were staying home and supporting their men. And essentially it is saying that 14-hour wives, so they have more housework to do than the men who are going out and working, and so giving women the ability to finish their work effectively and quickly before the men come home from work. And we see the play on words here with gold dust, so we can imagine that this is happening during the gold rush and everyone working in mines and things of that nature. Anyway, the idea here is, in putting everything else aside, not the way we would view it, not the way a Marxist theory would try to look at the way the social standing of the people that may or may not be impacted by this ad, but we want to focus on the word choice and the way that this ad would be situated in that time period, and the way that it would be that people will react to it from that time period. So moving on, another interesting theory is the formalist or new critical theory. So what this theory does is it takes away any outside perspective. So it is saying that the keys to understanding the text are within the text. So you're looking at things like structure, tone, word choice, word connotations, any other features, like if it's a poem, like where the lines stop and end, the punctuations that's being used. So and this is most often used for poetry because it is so detailed. You have to get in there and kind of look at what's making up the piece rather than any kind of outside perspective. So we're not worried about who wrote it, when it was written, our own feelings toward it, where they might be in what their place might be in society, whether they're male or female. None of that matters in this particular piece. They believe that you need to look at the piece itself in order to unlock that meaning. So with a formalist perspective, you want to think of things like the title, defining words, any patterns that you might see, any allusions, the point of view. So all of these literary elements that we have discussed in this class and you have discussed in other English classes are going to be at the forefront of this critical theory. So just for some perspective there, if we go back to, whoops, if we go back to our example that I pulled up, right? Because this is a piece of art, but it does contain some words. So we're going to look specifically at the placement of the words, what's bold, maybe the font being used, why they chose to justify things that the way that they did with the text, the image that they chose. So not the historical perspective, not our own perspective, but really focusing on what the artist has given us by their choices in the picture itself or in the advertisement itself. That would be the formalist perspective. Okay, so we talked about historicism, but there's also new historicism because I mentioned to you briefly about some of the issues with historical criticism. If the piece doesn't necessarily, if the setting and time period in the piece doesn't match up with the time period in which the author was writing and things of that nature. So what this does is it says historically, like all literature is seen as a historical artifact, but we have to consider that because of that, and because there's a person creating these, that we have to question any kind of artifact as a narrative. So all history can be questioned because it is created by a person, and a person has biases. And a lot of those biases come from the culture that is surrounding that particular creation. Okay, so this specifically looks at the cultural aspects of the time period and how that is going to impact the way the author may be viewing whatever the subject matter is. Okay? So they're looking at how this adds up with other things. They're putting into question the ideologies and things of that nature. One thing I want to mention, and that you'll see, most of these, see at the bottom here, it says often draws on Marxist and feminist theories in its analysis. The other thing you need to understand is that most of these theories don't live in isolation. We're talking about them in isolation so that you get a sense for the way each theory works. But, for example, most theories are paired up with another theory, and then that's how we come up with a proper analysis or critique. Eventually, we're going to get to the reader response. A lot of critical analysts use reader response along with whatever other theory they may be focused upon, because again, it doesn't often live alone in isolation. The only one that works well in isolation is that formalist or new criticism. But like I said, for our purposes, we're focusing on these one by one in order to force ourselves to get an understanding of each of these. So the next one is another one that you are probably quite familiar with. So the biographical critical theory is basically understanding what the author is writing because we understand something about his or her life. Now, what's interesting is we are talking about the direct influence of what the author's been through having an impact on his or her writing, art, etc. What we're not looking for is like a one-to-one relationship. We're not looking for an author that has a brother named Bob and then they have a character named Bob in the story. We're looking for more stretched kind of connections, if you will. So perhaps this author had dealt with an extreme situation, and we find out that their best friend when they were children passed away in a very tragic, like, boating accident. And so water and fish and boats and things like that become very symbolic in their writing. If you remembered the story of an Hour by Kate Chopin, the one that you used for the test at the end of Unit 1, Kate Chopin had a lot of children, and so she was known for doing most of her creative work within an hour's time during her day. So the symbolism of 1 hour becomes quite important in her life, and then, of course, reflected in that story. Also, her father did actually die in a train accident, so we see that coming across in that story as well. Her husband doesn't die, but we see the idea of that train accident coming to the forefront. So we always have to consider, why is it changed then? So if her father actually passed away, why then in the story doesn't her husband pass away? Just different things like that. So a lot of times biographical and psychoanalytic theories go hand in hand, because we're kind of getting into the inner workings of what might be causing that person to produce the work, the symbols, etc. Okay. So again, if we look at this, and some of these questions, the facts and how they suggest ideas in the work, so on and so forth. As I just mentioned, what events have been altered and why. So not just that they have been altered, but why might they have been altered. So this particular analysis, along with the historical perspectives, require you to do some outside research first to understand some things, so that when you put this lens on to read the piece, you have some idea of the author's background, some idea of the history of the time period or the culture that was prevalent, so on and so forth. So this is a big one. Psychoanalysis is huge. It's majorly focused on the theories of Sigmund Freud, and then there have been offshoots from this. So for example, one theory that we're not going to study directly in this course, but that is a prominent theory, is the archetypal theory, which comes from Carl Jung, who was a student of Freud. And again, just like with Marx, Freud didn't say, and this is how you're going to analyze literature. There were critical theorists who decided that this was an important way to view the characters or the author and their interaction, or what they're presenting through their work. So what's interesting about the psychoanalytic theory is it looks at the work as if it is like the dream of an author. So the outpouring in the work is maybe coming from those repressed desires, or something that they hadn't, that is coming out that they might not realize is affecting them. And so Freud is known for his dream analysis. So a lot of those symbols and what those things mean can be applied to the literature in order to take a look at what the author may have been saying or what might be repressed. You can also look at the interactions of the characters within the piece and apply the psychoanalytic theory to them. There might be some Oedipal ideals going on. If you don't know the story of Oedipus, look up a quick summary. But basically, Freud's Oedipal complex is based off of the Greek tragedy by Socrates, Oedipus the King, or Oedipus Rex. And in that story, to make a long story short, basically Oedipus is destined to kill his father, marry his mother. They get rid of him. He ends up fulfilling that destiny. So Freud took a look at that and said, man, that's really spot on. And that explains why young boys desire the favor of their mother and butt heads with the father, and so on and so forth. So it's not extreme as killing dad and marrying mom, but the desire to be in mom's favor or be close to mom, or if you ever hear anyone say, oh, you marry someone just like your mother, that sort of thing, all comes from the Oedipal complex. There's also the idea of the id, the ego, and the superego. Another one of Freud's more famous theories. So the id is the location of our drives, also known as the libido. So these are the things that we desire and want. The superego is the unconscious judgment of the self and others. So it's like the extreme on the other side. And the ego is this defense against the drive. So it's kind of in the middle, trying to balance all of this. So you might see some of this happening within characters. There might be a character that is very id-like, and a character that is very superego, and a character that's very ego. So there's a lot of different things you can do with this. So this is a huge theory, and when an analyst takes on this theory, they have to kind of pare it down to one or two of Freud's theories, or else it just gets way too out of control. But basically, we're looking at the expression of an author's unconscious mind in the work that they produce, and looking at the meanings contained and within that story and the symbols that are created. Okay. Whoops. Okay, so there are the questions that you can consider. Again, as I said, I will leave this. You will have access to this slideshow for your review at a later time. The gender theory is another large theory that is an umbrella, and underneath that umbrella are several other theories, the most famous of which is the feminist theory, and this is the one that is most used. So a lot of times gender theory is not what you hear this theory being called. Some people strictly focus on the feminist perspective of things. And just like with Marxism, it does take the ideals and history of feminism, so the different waves and the look of equality and inequality, the use of marginalized words and situations and things of that nature, and seeing how that affects the character and their situation. In the 90s, also coming about is something known as queer theory, which focuses on sexuality and power, and again, those marginalized populations and how those interactions are affected because of their gender and sexual identity. And this, of course, has become a more prominent theory recently. Now, what's interesting about these theories is you don't have to have a particular piece of literature that works for a theory. So you don't have to read a story that deals with a same-sex couple or a transgendered character or something like that in order to apply the queer theory. There is the idea with these theories is that you filter what is not being said through the analysis and kind of digging deeper. So you don't cherry pick the literature to fit the theory. The idea is that these theories fit any work of literature, and that you, in filtering through these lenses, are going to unveil or uncover something because of that particular filter. Okay. Another interesting thing about gender, whether it's queer theory or feminist theory, but gender in general, is looking at the fact that men and women are different. They write differently, they read things differently, they write about different subject matters, and they're going to react to things differently, and that these differences are important when considering the analysis of gender, and it's important to literature. Those questions? Expectations are important. So the stereotypes and the things that certain genders are supposed to be doing because they are that particular gender, and seeing if those, are prominent in the piece and affecting the way that the characters are interacting or the situation that they're in. Last one, reader response. I mentioned this earlier, and again, this is one that often takes on a secondary filter. So it's oftentimes applied to something else. But this is considering that it's pretty much the opposite of formalist criticism. So formalist or new criticism is the one that focuses on the piece itself is what gives us meaning. So your reaction doesn't matter, historical background doesn't matter, so on and so forth. Reader response basically says that a text does not have meaning without the person reading it. So without someone deriving meaning or having a meaningful connection with literature, the meaning of that piece is irrelevant or essentially does not exist. Okay? So the reader or the viewer of the art, if you want to think about it in that perspective, is the integral piece that makes it a valid piece of art, because without anyone viewing it, reacting to it, etc., that it doesn't necessarily have meaning. Okay. Now, just because this is called reader response, it doesn't mean that just any willy-nilly idea you have is valid and can be used. But Again, we're thinking about the why. So if you're having a particular reaction, why are you having that reaction? Or what is making you think about it in this way? So there has to be something backing up your assumption, your interpretation. It can't just be whatever you want it to be because, well, it's reader response. Okay. So one thing about reader response, it's interesting to think about when you go into reading a piece, who was intended to read this piece, who's actually reading the piece, right? So who, like everyone writes, most authors are writing with a particular audience in their mind. Who's that audience? And then who's actually reading it? And the differences between those two audiences can be interesting to think about in the way that they have chosen their words or the characters or the situations that they have created. And again, the importance of the interaction between the text and the reader and creating meaning in that way. Wow, 35, almost 36 minutes right now. Man, oh man. I haven't done this much talking since before March 13th, I don't think. I got a scratchy throat now. But anyhow, as I mentioned, the good news is we're done with that. You only need to watch this video one time and you will have access to this PowerPoint. I do suggest that you download it. You will be wanting to come back and review these things as you're being asked to apply these theories. As I mentioned, do not feel overwhelmed right now. I know in saying that, it's easier to say that as I'm on this end and you're on that end. But the idea here is to just start getting an idea of what these theories entail. We're going to be doing activities that will require you to start thinking about these theories individually, and we will work up to more intricate and involved activities. So the first activities are just to start to get you to think about things through these lenses. And I think you'll start to see as the rubber starts to hit the road, so to speak, that these aren't as intimidating as they seem. You should also know that we're not going to be there's not going to be a test on this sort of thing. We're going to be using it in its actual purpose. So we're going to be doing some activities so that you start to see how these are applied, why it's important, and then we're going to look at some critical essays. And you've already seen some critical essays in class before we left. With our short stories, and we'll be doing that again. We'll be pulling some critical essays and analyzing them and thinking about what theory or theories they were using and starting to think about writing our own critical analyses and things of that. So a little bit of writing, a little bit of activities, no big test, nothing like that, nothing that should be stressing you out, just getting the idea that in order to effectively adult, we oftentimes have to be able to put ourselves in other people's shoes, so to speak, and to look at things from many angles. And this is a big part of that. So although we are talking about literature specifically, the idea of putting on a lens and trying to step back and view things in a way that you may not have viewed them in the first sense can really help you in your relationships, in your jobs, if you're the manager, things of that nature. So there are a lot of real life there's a lot of real importance in real life that comes from our study of these critical approaches. And that is that. Thank you for listening, and we will start our activities tomorrow. Have a lovely day.